Um, this was done about 15, 16 years ago, and I still had some questions about how barns were scribed, particularly the English barn. And I decided to put up a barn and work out the little tricks about how things were done traditionally with the Scribe Rule. And I wrote a series of articles about its construction that was published in Timber Framing, if you're interested. There's one article about the sort of the barn type in general. There's two on the scribing process, the actual carpentry process, one on the raising of the building, and then one on traditional ways of finishing the English barn. So if you're interested, that's available from the Timber Framers Guild. So anyway, the English barn is a barn type that was common all over the Northeast, certainly in New England. In fact, it's virtually a standard layout. You'll find the same layout in Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont and Massachusetts. I mean, there's a few variations and exceptions, of course, but it's a pretty standardized plan. And it's almost as though when the immigrants came off the ships, somebody was handing out, cards that said, "This is the barn you want to build. This is the barn. Just pass it out to everybody," because they're so similar, even though they're spread over a wide range. And I've never found anything written or published about this plan contemporary with those early settlers. There's nothing in Moxon or any of these early builders guides that I could find that showed the layout that we're left with here. And it's basically a gabled roof building with entrances on the side walls. Typically, occasionally there's an entrance on a gable, a small door on the gable, but typically there's a large barn doorway into the center bay, and then smaller doors into animal bays on either side of that. This drawing only has it on one side. This is a very early small version. But they're typically a 3-bay structure, and of course a bay is the area between each cross frame in the building, for those of you who aren't familiar with that. So a typical barn is a 3-bay barn with a side entrance into the center bay. Now the plan, this is the sort of the standard plan that you'll find. Occasionally I'll see a mirror image of this, depending on which way the barn is facing. But here you can see the 3 bays, and the threshing bay is the center bay that you could pull a wagon into. And that was not centered on the barn. It's typically offset to one side, because the cows off to the right of that didn't need as much space as some other functions. So here's the base sizes here. It's 10 foot for the cows, 11 foot for the threshing floor, and then 19 for the large bay with the hay mow and the draft animals in it. And these could vary a little bit. It could be as small as 9 feet for the cows and as big as 11 feet. The center bay could be 12 or 14 sometimes. So you get slight variations. But overall size is typically about 30 feet by 40 feet. And I'm going to talk more about that in a little while, about that 30 by 40. But so here's the layout. And let me get a pointer for you here. If I can find it. So first of all, the threshing bay is very important in the barn, because these barns were all-purpose barns. They weren't a single function. It wasn't just like a dairy barn where there's just nothing but dairy production. These were sort of an everything building. And so there'd be a little bit of threshing done for a grain crop. There'd be some cows, there'd be some draft animals, horses in some barns, but in the hill towns where I live, virtually all the barns were framed for oxen as their draft animals. And then sometimes if these barns are built on the side of a hill, there might be pigs or sheep underneath, the shallow sort of crawl space underneath the barn that would have some other animals. But they were self-sufficient buildings. So it was like the one building does everything. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of the other functions in here. But anyway, the threshing floor was for the grain crop. And that would be stored prior to threshing on poles laid across the two tie beams in that threshing floor area until it was seasoned. And then they'd bring it down and do the threshing and winnowing on that floor. So it was essential to have big doors at one or both ends of that threshing floor. Now, in this case, there's a big door on the south end and a smaller door on the other end. But there has to be doors at both ends, whether they're big or small, to get the cross draft for winnowing the crop. And this was typically the only wooden floor in the barn. The animals would typically stand on the dirt, unless it was built on the side of a hill, for instance. So the cows would stand right on the ground and be down a little bit lower than the threshing floor by a foot or so. And the manure would be left there and then broken out in the spring. So it would do its composting in the barn. They would just throw some straw on it. And it was right on the ground. So the cows would step over that sill to get into the barn. And but the threshing floor was that carefully fitted floor that you do the grain threshing on. And that was sort of the feature of the barn. You know, a lot of people think these barns had a wooden floor throughout, but typically they didn't. So the cows would accommodate up to about a dozen cows. I found ones with original stanchions and a 30-foot wide building that was a dozen cows, which is kind of surprising, but they were smaller animals then, I guess. And there would be hay storage up above the cows for their feed. And then on the opposite side, where the draft animals were, was usually on the southern side of the building. It would have its own door to go out as well. So the animals typically didn't go in and out of the barn through the threshing floor. That was sort of like your living room floor there. You wouldn't want animals going through that unless you're pulling a load of crop in. And typically they were set up for 4 animals in there, and they would face just the way they're shown here. And that would have a ceiling over it that had hay storage. And then the maw was just a big open bay, whatever was left here, and that would be storage of hay from floor to peak, basically. And if there was a ladder in the barn, it would be around this post. Sometimes they put pegs in on different angles going around this post, so it was like a spiral ladder. And a lot of times there'd be a ladder here as well to get up into that high loft or the threshing platform up above. And notice what I say here, beef roll above. I'm going to show you some pictures of what these look like, but this is a butchering device that's in most of the barns, or there's evidence that there was one. And that's where animals were hauled up for slaughter right in the light of the doorway. They'd be hung there to be slaughtered. So we got our little doors into each side bay here. And these are typically like a 3-foot door, a 3.5-foot door. Rarely I've seen 2 doors into this bay, and occasionally you'll find one on the gable here into this bay, but they're pretty typically where I've got them drawn here. And also the layout of this, you'll notice that this post is not centered, nor this one here. This bay for the horses or oxen is usually 10 feet. And because of the scribing process, if you turn this bent around, switch it around, it lines up with that post. So this post is 10 feet from that end as well. I mean, sometimes it's in the middle, but if you've ever wondered why, it has to do with the scribing process. And as far as the compass direction here, north is usually somewhere in this range, but it varies depending on where the road is. These barns are usually built right on the road and separate from the house as well. In later years, they would move them and join them up with the house and the outhouse and the back house and the woodshed and all that. But originally they were built as a freestanding building some distance from the house. So where does this prototype come from? I've really scratched my brain on this. I've been in a good part of England, And it doesn't appear in most of England because animals can be left out through the winter in southern England, whereas they can in most of the Northeast. You have to have them inside. So I think they used as a prototype a Yorkshire barn, which is quite similar here. This is I got this out of a book. This is a stone barn or a brick barn with the center threshing bay, which would have been a dirt floor with stone, like flagstones on it. But there was cows along one side with a loft above. So that's the closest thing I can come to that these English settlers would have sort of in their catalog of barn types to pick from. By the way, if anybody finds any evidence of handouts that they were given out when they got off the ships, I'd love to hear about that. So here's the cow bay. I found just a handful of barns that had original setup in them for the cows. This barn is from about 1800 in the town of Savoy, Massachusetts, and it has original cow stanchions for 12 cows, and it's all hand hewn or riven parts with wooden pegs. I mean, this has had some pieces nailed onto it later, but all the original stuff is still there. And I documented this. And then about a week after I did it, the fire department burned the barn down for practice. So it was kind of sad to see that go. But anyway, it had the stanchions where they put the cow's head through there and then slide this upright over and put a pin in there to hold. In fact, I got a close up of that right here, minus the pin. But these are all hewn parts. That's like a 5x5 timber with a slot cut in it for the stanchion to slide back and forth in on there. The threshing bay, as I said, would have a carefully fitted wood floor. It could be tongue and grooved, or it could be a double layer of planks and boards, and the plank underneath the joint would keep the crop, the grain from filtering through down below. You don't want to lose your crop. And they're virtually always held with wooden pins rather than forged ones. And they're fairly wide planks. These are 14.5 inches. And they use square pins to secure them down. So it's instead of making an octagon when you're making your pins, excuse me, you would make them square and drill a round hole and drive a square pin in there, and that the head would be slightly flared so it would draw the plank down and hold it securely. And the threshing was done by hand on these floors. It's not like the Dutch or Germanic buildings where they had animal-powered threshing. It was a small operation, so it was done with hand flails. And in fact, the floors are usually too narrow to do any kind of mechanical threshing on them. Anyway, this is my barn floor, and that's an old flail that was used to beat the grain. And it has a swivel head on it. In fact, there you can see the square or rectangular headed pegs on my barn. So this is what the pegs look like. Again, you split them out to this rectangular shape and then shape them to a rough square and a blunt point. And that will actually suck that flooring down just like a screw or a ring shank nail would do. And here's a barn in New York State that was dismantled. And here's the threshing floor of that barn. And there's a couple of interesting things here. One is you can see all those pegs are still in there. They didn't come out. When they pulled the threshing boards up, the pegs stayed there. They're probably hardwood, and both the pegs and the joist. But also you'll notice that the joists run the full length of the threshing floor. So, and that's pretty typical. It's only some of the later ones where they started going in two spans. But there's a large sleeper in the middle, sometimes two at the third points, and then the joists run right across. And the reason for this is because this barn, this threshing floor had to function much like a raft. It had to be able to float up and down with the frost and stay together. And if you've got joints in your framing halfway down the floor, you're going to get gaps in the boards. It's going to loosen up and you're going to lose your grain out through the cracks. So this floor was essential to the farming operation. Now, another thing you find inside is that evidence of that butcher's windlass that I talked about, or beef roll. So a lot of times this is all that remains. This is the opposite sides of the threshing floor in the tie beam. One side had a 3-inch diameter hole. The other one had a drop-in 3-inch pocket. So you could obviously get this thing in and out of there. You usually find some evidence of this because everybody has animals. They're all going to be doing butchering. Occasionally there's a separate building for that. Here's a butcher's windlass still intact on a barn. And you can see it's basically a log where the ends are turned down to about a 4-inch diameter or 3-inch diameter. And they sit in some sort of bearing plate. Here it's a block sitting right up on top. And there's 2 holes bored through. You can only see one here, but there'll be one perpendicular to that going through the other way. And it works like a windlass on a ship, where you have chains wrapped around the middle of this thing hanging down that attach to the animal's legs, the rear legs of the animal. And then you put long poles into these holes and rotate them around. It takes 2 people, and one person goes as far as they can, and then the other person puts their pole into the next hole, and so on. So it gives you great mechanical advantage. It's probably a 40-to-1 lifting power on this thing. Of course, it would take a while, but that was the way it was done. Occasionally, there's a large wheel on there, and I think I got a picture of that. So here's a barn. It's an English barn with you can't see it, but it has the gunstock posts here. They just nail down with big spikes this hardwood board or plank and cut the bearing plates out of that. Here's another variety I've seen in a barn. Yeah, here's one with a larger pulley attached to it to give you mechanical advantage. And when you see these, there's usually a rope that went up over this thing, or a chain, and it worked kind of like a chain fall would work to haul something up. This one's at the opposite end. It's not in front of the doorway, in front of the big doorways. It's the other end of the barn. I suspect it's been moved, and there may be a later version of it. Now, another thing you find in these barns, which no one's written about as far as I know, other than me, is that just like in their counterparts in England, they had a dovecote. And a dovecote is a place to raise pigeons. And that's basically a free food on the farm. The pigeons would glean there's things from the fields and the woods and from the manure piles of the cows. And it's basically one more source of food on the farm. And they're usually high up in the gable ends, one or the other gables, not usually both ends. And a lot of times they've been planked over, boarded over. And occasionally there'd be a platform up there on the collars or purlin ties up in the upper triangle of the roof at the gable. Here's one that's been boarded over. They're about 6 inches, 8 inches or so in dimension, and up near the peak. And I've sometimes found notches where they'd had a platform up there, and it's gone now, but there was a way to get up there and service the animals. Another feature of these barns was gutters, or eave troughs, as my grandfather always called them. And you're probably wondering why they put gutters on barns. And it wasn't to prevent splashing at the ground level, or to make the building last longer, or to provide a fall activity to pull the leaves out of the gutter. It was to collect rainwater for the animals. And they're usually just on one side of the barn, and it's the side that has the animal doors. And I suspect there would have been a large wooden barrel or trough, something the animals could get into to drink out of, at one end. And they usually pitch towards the cow end, the cow doorway end. And if you talk with a farmer, they say today's cows need about 5 gallons of water per cow. So if you got 12 cows, that's 600 gallons of water. And if you got a 2-gallon bucket you're lowering down into a well, you're going to be there a good part of the morning just getting the water out each day for the animals. So occasionally you don't find gutters at all. It's usually because the barn is near a pond or a stream or some sort of natural water source, where this first thing in the morning, animals will go out and drink on their own. But the gutters would have been necessary. Of course, these are right out in the weather, and they don't last a long time. This is my own gutter on a barn, and it's a single piece. And I think the first winter it came off the snow sliding off the barn, and it's even set down below the level of the snow, but there was ice that filled it and it came all off. So I had to put it back up there and nail it in there. So it hasn't come off since. But anyway, so that was an essential feature, but very little evidence survives for this. And by the way, this is how they were made, with a gutter adze. You've probably seen these kicking around, and they still call them gutter adzes. And it takes probably half a day to cut this out between the axe and the adze to create this gutter. And I haven't found a lot of gutters from barns. I've seen quite a few from old houses, and I've saved some samples of those, but the barns are much simpler. It's basically, in this case, it was a 3x5 or 4x5 timber that was hewn out. And this is the end of it right here. You can see that it tapered out. It came back up. There was no, it didn't go all the way to the end of the piece. In other words, the taper was mostly in the gutter itself. And although those the supporting pegs would be on a downhill run as well, which is how I know which way the gutter faced. Anyway, this was reused as a floor joist in a barn, and it's a rare survival. You know, if anybody has pictures of this kind of stuff reused, I'd love to see that. This barn in also in Savoy had original brackets still in it on that one side. There were 4 brackets surviving, and they were made out of yellow birch, surprisingly, which is not a rot-resistant wood. And the roof's been extended. It wasn't really, wouldn't have had this big of overhang originally, and that's what protected them, I guess. So that's why it's a rare survivor. You know, that being out in the weather, it wouldn't have lasted long. And I pulled a couple of these out and brought them home and photographed them and measured them and documented them. And this is that barn that was burned by the fire department. So I'm really glad I pulled these out and saved them rather than get destroyed. So here they are. I only took out 2. I should have taken all 4 of them. But I used them as a prototype for my barn. And I don't know exactly what went on out here because it's rotted away, but I think the trough just either sat on that, or there was a slight notch here that would encompass the bottom of the trough to keep it from sliding off the building. And those were 2-inch diameter pins, by the way. And you still find a lot of those holes in the barns, which tells me what kind of gutter was on there. It wasn't just the English. The Dutch also used wooden eave troughs, so you'll find the same holes in Dutch barns. Another variant are these large forged spikes that were driven in, functioning in much the same way. I've only found a handful of these. Here's one where they're gone, but it was just a 1-inch board that was poked through the siding and nailed into the side of one of the posts. And it would have had a little notch cut in the board for the gutter to fit into also. So that was just a 1-inch thick board. Probably depending on whether a carpenter did it or whether the farmer himself put the gutters up. Now let's talk a little bit about the size of these barns. And this is from the direct tax census of 1798, which was in a lot of places around the country. And this is the list of all the barn sizes in the town of Coleraine. And you can see that there's one of these, one of these, one of these, and then there's 39 of the 30x40s. And I suspect even the 30x50s and the 30x45 and 30x60s are the same barn that's been added onto. So the 30x40 is a sort of a perfect size for these barns, but it's also, I think, alludes to the 3-4-5 triangle, which was a very common proportion in these buildings. And as you know, the 3-4-5 triangle is the perfect Pythagorean triangle. You remember that from high school or grade school? I'm not sure when they teach it now, but a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So it was a common thing for builders to know, but it was secretive for everybody else until, I suspect, probably later in the 1800s, it was a secret thing, you know. And if you didn't know it, you couldn't be a builder. And it was not taught in schools. So I don't think people appreciate how important that 3-4-5 triangle is in building. But anyway, 30 by 40s are pretty common. So if somebody calls me on the phone with an English barn, I can pretty much tell them the layout of their barn inside and how big it is, and I'll be pretty close to being right on it. I mean, you can see that 90-something% of the barns are that size in this particular town. And the geometry, I noticed pretty early on that these barns were all laid out so you could inscribe an equilateral triangle in the cross section of the barn from either the top of the sill or the bottom of the sill to the peak of the roof. Would be this perfect equilateral triangle, which is a very stable, it makes the building look very stable. If the building was just as tall as it was wide, that would mean that the shape, the barn shape, would be equally at home on its side as it is on its bottom. But the fact that it's slightly shallower than it is, slightly shorter than it is wide, makes it look much more stable in the landscape. It just looks like it's going to last. And I'm not sure if that's what they were thinking of, but that's what that shape does. And of course, the equilateral triangle is the basis for a lot of things. It's the basis for the faces of pyramids and the Greek temples and Gothic architecture in general. I mean, the Gothic arch is based on equilateral triangles. So I guess it's always been an important geometric figure in buildings. Now, this particular building is quite unusual because it's 30 by 40, but it's also has the rafters spaced at roughly 3 feet on center, and then 4 feet on center in the middle bay, and then 5 feet on center in the big bay. And there's no earthly structural reason for doing that. There's not going to be any more snow at one end of that roof than at the other end. So what it is the builder's playing with the geometry with that 3-4-5 proportion. He's flaunting the fact that he knows that to probably most of the other builders. It does create a false perspective. When you're in the barn, if you're in this end looking down, it makes the barn look shorter. If you're standing at that end looking back, it makes it look longer than it really is. And they did play around with proportions like that in houses, I know. So I wouldn't see why it wouldn't be an issue with barns as well. Occasionally the girts in these barns would have one at 3 feet, one at 4 feet, and one at 5 feet apart. This one only has the 2 spaces, but typically just 3. So again, they love playing with that proportion. And here you can see this is the south wall of the barn, so you can see the doorway for the cows and the doorway for horses. Now this barn, we know they had horses, or at least they designed for horses, because this girt is a foot higher than that girt. So horses are taller than cows, and it's usually 6 inches or a foot higher if there were horses at that end. So let's talk a little bit about the carpentry, which is why some of you probably joined onto this to hear about this stuff. So before 1820, generally, most buildings are put together by the Scribe Rule, and that's also in German and Dutch and French and basically all nationalities that came here prior to about this time would be using some sort of Scribe Rule system. But we're going to talk about the English variant of that. And of course, it didn't have a name until it was superseded by the Square Rule. And then you start seeing people calling it the Scribe Rule. But before then, it was just carpentry. It was the way carpentry was done for eons. And it says here, whenever two sticks were framed to come together, it was all done in a custom fashion. So each piece could only fit into the one that it was designed to go into. And then, of course, it'd be numbered so they could determine that when they went to put the building up. And this was the standard operating system. So we're going to talk about this first, and then I'll talk about what replaced it after that. So when the builders thought of a building, a timber frame building like this, it was thought of as a series of two-dimensional frames put together to make a three-dimensional building. And this is an English house here from England, in fact. So it's not the perfect example for this. But you can see that there's floor frames, there's roof frames, wall frames, longitudinal wall frames, as well as cross frames. And each one of these frames would have to be scribed as an assembly, laying flat on the ground or on the floor structure. And all the components scribed within that. And each step of that might be 3 steps to scribing each one of those sections. So there's an intense amount of work. You're handling a lot of timber, and you're bringing pieces back that were already scribed in one frame. You're bringing back to scribe in the next frame. Like for instance, the posts here are scribed in the longitudinal wall, but they're also scribed in the transverse walls as well. So a good deal of the timber is scribed in more than one plane. So there's quite a bit of work on this. So here's an illustration. It's out of a German book, but it gives you an idea for a typical wall here. It's not done in one step. You don't just throw everything on and scribe it. It's done in phases. So the first phase would be the primary pieces, the posts, plates, sills, and you would lay those out, scribe them, cut the joints, put it back together, set it up again, level it and square it again, and then set on the secondary pieces. In this case, there were these studs, and then scribe those pieces, cut the joints, put it back together again with those pieces in it. And then in this case, there was a third level of scribing with these framing around the windows and doors, which it may not be on barns. But anyway, you can see that each one of these little frames takes some time, and they have to be set level and square each time when you do that. Because when you're going to scribe pieces on there, it has to be sort of in the final plane that it's supposed to be in. So that was all done typically on the floor deck. And then before you can disassemble that, you have to number everything, because these pieces are meant to go in only one place, only one spot, and you can't mix them up generally. Now, there's the only exception to that is rafters. If you're doing common rafters on a building, as long as the two number 2 rafters are together, for instance, that's what counts. The rafters don't have to be in the number 2 position, but you have to have the 2 number 2 rafters going together at the peak. And in fact, I often find that the gable rafters might be the 1 and the 15 or whatever, but the intermediate ones can be jumbled up. As long as the 2 7s are together and 2 8s are together, you're good. And these are just some of the different numbers you find. This is the system that I used on my barn, the circles, half circles, but they're all based on Roman numerals, basically. So, but not exactly like the clock. So number 4 is 4 single ones, and a number 9 is usually a V with 4 ones. There's another way to do that here, but there's not a picture of it here. But that's why they're not confusing, because these numbers are actually made, the V's are made upside down. And I'll show you a picture of the tool that made these marks. But the 5s are made upside down. So you can see that if it would be very confusing if you put the 1 on the other side of the 5 and you're trying to make it a 4. So if there's a V with a 1, it's always a 6. It's never a 4, like on the clock. And with these circles, I'll show you the tool that was used to do that. Typically on the longitudinal work, there's no circles. On the cross frames is where you do the circles, and there'll be a half circle on one bent, a whole circle on the next bent, 2 half circles on the next one, and 2 whole circles on the last one. So it's just a way of saving on numbers instead of getting up into really high numbers, like, excuse me, like this 25 and 30 over here. You can keep your numbers much smaller by using these circles. And you can also do Arabic numbers and letters as well with this tool. And here's an example in a barn. This is a what's called a marriage mark, where the mark goes right across the joint. Here there happens to be some wane separating it, but these marks were scratched right across the joint. So there's no question, even if the number's wrong, when you put the brace onto this post, those numbers, those lines will all line up. So you know you've got the right piece. It's you almost don't have to see what number it is. You know it's right because it was made when that joint was together. So here's a tool that does that. It's called a race knife or timber scribe. And it has a compass point, and then here's the hooked knife, which actually scoops out a little bit of wood. So it's kind of like a gouge. It takes out a recess of wood. Go back to this here. You can kind of see it here. It's not just a scratch mark. It's actually some wood has been removed on there. And if you find a date in the barn made with this tool, it's pretty much it's pretty assuredly that it's the builder that made the mark and that it's the date of the building. In fact, those circles, if there's happens to be a check going through the circle and it's distorted, it won't be a circle anymore because of the opening of the check. And that's further proof that it was done when the timber was green. And unless the builder was lying about the date when he put it on in the first place, I would go by that as the actual date of the construction. In fact, here we go, right there. So there's that circle you can see has been spread out here. Here's the other part of that circle. So that date was put in the post when the post was still green. This is a piece of beech, which is great for carving dates in it. It's just a wonderful wood for working. Now, I didn't talk about species of wood because that's kind of dependent on where the barn is. But if you were to take a survey of the English barns in New England, the two most common species you'd find would be beech and spruce. Everybody thinks it's going to be oak and chestnut. Certainly in southern New England, in Connecticut, Rhode Island, eastern and southern Mass, you're going to get oak and chestnut. But the whole of northern New England is much more common to find beech and spruce for timber frames. So I think in my town, I don't think I've seen an oak timber in an English barn. And I'll find things like yellow birch and sugar maple as well. So it's whatever was workable was on the client's property. In fact, the farmer would be dragging out the logs, typically himself, to either hew out or bring to the sawmill. So the material is usually what was right on the property from the get-go. Another way to mark things was with a gouge, and this is a gouge is of course curved chisel, and this is number 9 right here. That's a V and 4 single gouges on here. So again, this would be maybe the cross frames would have the gouge marks, and the longitudinal frames had straight chisel marks. It's just another way of differentiating parts. But when I see this, when I see a gouge used as a marking device, a numbering device, I would pretty much say the barn is before 1800, because prior to 1800, they didn't have the Scotch pattern auger, which would start its own hole. You had to use a gouge to start to create a little shallow depression for the auger to start in. And the oldest Scotch pattern auger evidence I find is about 1795. So this is just a side thing here, but it's helpful. I mean, if I see those marks when I walk in a barn, I'm thinking, okay, we're probably before 1800 here, and it's always worked out that way. So the feature of these barns, one of the things that makes them English, I guess, is the fact that they're using this English tying joint, which has been around since 1250 in England, and was used in England right up to the end of the tradition there, and used up in our country till 1820, 1830, depends on where you are. But it's an ingenious joint that makes use of a post with a flared top. They call these jowled posts or gunstock posts. Sometimes it's just a tapered post. There's a long taper from top to bottom. And it has two tenons on top. One goes into the plate and the other one goes into the bottom of the tie beam. And then where the tie beam laps over the plate, there's a lap dovetail joint right there. Maybe a half dovetail or maybe a full dovetail. In some of the later barns, it becomes a cog joint, which is less likely to withdraw from shrinkage. And then the rafter will join right into the top of the tie beam. So it creates these rigid triangles in the roof structure here at every bay, which makes it a very stable roof. And I used to think that this barn, this joint design was just done for structural reasons, but I know it's not now. It was done to facilitate the scribing process. So the beauty in this joint is that although it's a three-dimensional joint, it allows you to assemble each one of the two-dimensional components completely with joinery by themselves. So for instance, you can assemble the plate with the tie beams, which is one of the scribing processes. And these notches will hold the plates where they're supposed to be. And you can scribe the roof frame triangle laying flat. You can scribe the longitudinal wall with the post pegged right to the plate. And you can scribe the cross frames where the post is pegged to the bottom of the tie beam. And if you think about it like a drop tie frame, you can't do that with. So it makes the scribing more difficult. So you'll find that as soon as the Scribe Rule kind of went out of fashion, so did the English tying joint. I've only seen a handful of buildings that had square rule framing and English tying joints, and it looked like it was much more work than necessary when you do see that. So the scribing process itself is a bit complicated. I'm just going to kind of breeze through it here for you. There's two operations the English used to scribe a joint, and the most common one is called tumbling. It's used wherever you have a timber going between two other timbers. It's pretty simple. And you basically lay it over the top and rotate it 90 degrees down until the top corner is touching the top corners of the two bottom timbers. So you rotate it 90 degrees, and then you put a tick mark on there at each end, which gives you your length between the two top edges. So this length right here. Then you rotate the beam back up, which is what it's in this position. And there's your tick marks at each end, right? And by the way, this dotted line here is the joinery plane. So they would snap lines on each of the faces that are necessary to have mortise and tenon joints cut on them. And that line is one side of the mortise or the tenon. Here, you can see it down here. It represents one side or the other. It's usually 1.5 inches or 2 inches off the face. So with this back in position here, you then apply a square to the bottom face of the timber, the face of the bottom timber. And with a mallet, you'll tap on the end of this beam until that mark lines up with the edge of that square. And then you draw a line. And then you repeat the process on the other side of that before you move it. And then you go down the other end and put that square on here and tap this one back and forth this way until that tick mark lines up with your square, and draw that line. So now you've got the length on the top surface and you've got the angles of the lower timbers on there. It's a pretty quick operation. It takes seconds to do this, unless it's some big timber where you're really beating on it. But if it's like studs or braces, is a very, very fast way to scribe something. It's brainless, sort of. It's quick, it's simple, and it's pretty accurate. So that's tumbling. And of course, I didn't mention, but all this stuff has been leveled and set up square. You know, the deck, whatever, is all squared. So when you scribe these things, they're going to be in their final setup. Now, the other operations is too complicated to explain in a lot of detail, but it's a way of scribing the three-dimensional tying joint where the post, the English tying joint, where the post and the plate and the tie beam all come together. And it's basically a double cut or cut and try system where you cut a short tenon on the top of your post, which is right here. And I say short, if it's going to be 4 inches when it's done, you cut it maybe 3.5 or 3 1/4 or something. And that's up to the builder how much they want to leave to scribe. And plug it in the mortise where it's supposed to go. And then take a pair of dividers and trace all the way around the 4 sides of the joint. Take it back out, recut it a second time, and put it back in. So it's double cutting the tenon to get the shoulders to mate perfectly with the other timber. Now, so on these posts, there's 2 tenons on top. So the first one you do that with, that's simple operation. But the second one, you can't just, come up with an arbitrary point. You have to know where it's going to end up exactly. And they did that by applying what's called a 2-foot mark here. Before the first assembly is taken apart, they put a mark that's 2 feet down from the dovetail on the plate. And it usually has a half circle or a whole circle through it, or sometimes 2 half circles, 2 whole circles, whatever. Some variant of circles, and it might be a half circle on one side and a whole circle on the other, but it's just representing this 2-foot mark so you can find it quickly. And so you cut a short tenon, and when you put it together, you put your square on there, which is 2 feet long. And the distance left between the square and that 2-foot line is what you set your dividers for, and then scribe around the 4 sides of the joint here to indicate how much more you have to take off to make that thing fit perfectly, so that when it's together, it allows exactly enough space in here for the plate to run through, because the plate is running this way right through that joint. So, and the French had something like this as well. They call it a bring me back line. The Germans did it, I know, and I'm not sure what they called it, but it's a way of cutting these 3-dimensional joints. And it's also used anytime you don't want to have to put together the whole assembly. So if you're doing a big anchor beam bend in a Dutch barn, for instance, you might use this on each end independently, so you don't have to have the whole assembly together. So anyway, that's the double cut or cut and try system. Now, any timber that's assembled in more than one cross frame requires a level mark. So when you put the first assembly together to scribe, before you take it apart, you find a spot, generally in the middle of a timber, in a convenient place where it's not in the way of any joinery, and you fix it with a plane or a chisel or a slick or something so that it's straight across at that point, level. And you can put a level on there and it reads a level in that position. And that is your reference on that timber. So, you're dealing with hewn timbers. They may be twisted. They may be out of square. They may have ups and downs in them. But you have to have some spot on each of those timbers that indicates a level plane, because these timbers will then have to be set up in a perpendicular plane. And now that level mark becomes a plumb mark. So it's essential to have this mark on every timber. And on a plate, you might get 3 of these marks, one in each of the bays of the barn, because it's long. And in order to use these marks, when you're creating your joinery planes, you have to be able to sight to the square on the timber. So if the square is 20, 30 feet away, it's hard to sight that. So you'll typically will have marks not that far apart on a plate. Like I said, there would be 3 marks. So I'm going to run through the scribing on my own barn, which is not quite 30 by 40, but it's that proportion anyway. It's 25.5 by 34 feet. So I couldn't fit a 30 by 40 on the site. Anyway, so the first step is to do the main floor level framing. And that is the 2 long sills here and here, and the 4 cross sills. And these are tumbled into position pretty quickly. And then you'll put those together. And then you set on the secondary pieces, which in this case are the joists that run front to back of the barn underneath the threshing floor. That's the only floor in this barn. Traditionally, I ended up putting wood floors on both sides, but Originally, it would have been just the threshing floor in the middle, and there's a sleeper in the middle to hold up the middles of those beams. So they're being set up here for scribing, and here I'm chopping them into position. You cut them first on the two sides, put them in upside down into the pockets on the floor, and then you chop out until it's flush. Here I'm using an adze to finish it until it's flush with the floor sill, and then you flip it over. So the beauty of that is it holds the joist in position while you're doing a lot of that banging with the axe and the adze, and you don't have to really measure it. I mean, if that pocket was deeper than the other pockets, it wouldn't matter because the joist is, you're cutting it custom to fit that particular pocket. So at this point, I put it on my foundation, and I'm not sure at what point they would have done it on the site. Maybe they did all of this on the foundation. I know they were typically done at the owner's property. They wouldn't have framed it at their own shop and then transported it to the owner's property. In later times, you know, when there's urban areas and there's sawmills and woodworking shops and things, they may have framed it on their own shop property and then put it on a wagon and brought it to the site. But the evidence shows that the scribing was done for these first sort of period buildings here, not first period, but first buildings in the town. They were done on site. In fact, you oftentimes find blocks underneath from the cutting process still on the ground underneath. So the next phase after you do the floor is to do the eave level plan of the building, which is the plates and the tie beams. So here they've been set on there, and you flush them up basically with the timbers below. So you don't have to square this up anymore, level it, because the floor is leveled and squared underneath it. So if you basically are flushing it up with what's below, you're good. Now in my barn, I have a board channel on both the tie beams and the bottom of the plate. You can see it right here if you got a good image, but we'll see another picture of that later. So it's not actually flush, it's 2 inches out. So the inner side of that board channel is flush with the sill for what it's worth. So that's the second phase. So you're basically doing the bottom of the box and then the top of the box laid right on top of that bottom. And now you're going to do the long sides of the barn. So here we are with the posts and the plate, and it's all set up square. You see we got a tapered or a gunstock post here, but the top of this is level. And we've scribed the posts with that double cut to meet the wall plate. And we've inserted the post in there. And you see they haven't been cut to length here yet, but we're just going to plumb up from the edge of the sill to get the bottoms of our posts. And so this is the, excuse me, the first phase of the scribing. And here's a close-up showing the plate. You can see that board channel in there. And that's a hewn plate and a sawed post. I want to make sure that all these scribing techniques work for both sawn as well as hewn timbers. And the draw boring or the offsetting of the peg holes was done by drilling the hole in the mortise before you put the piece on, bringing it together as tight as you can get it, pricking using the bit or a scribe, pricking the hole on the tenon, sliding the piece back out a little bit, offsetting the hole closer to the shoulder, and then boring right through the post. So this is draw boring. It's offsetting the peg hole so it pulls the joint tight. I know most timber framers are familiar with this operation, but many people may not have even heard of this. But it was a standard practice for making your joints snug when you put them together and keeping them snug as they dry, season, and rack. So here's the other wall completed with the door header. And here's a door opening. You can see 2 door openings here, the smaller animal doors and the diagonal bracing. And so this bent is finished. It'll be numbered and then taken apart. And it's held together with these iron pins. You need to secure this while you're working on it, but you don't want to use wooden pins because if it rains, they swell up and you have a double of a time trying to getting them out of there. So builders use hook pins, and I got a picture of that coming up. Yeah, let's go on here. Now you notice the braces are sharing a mortise here. Structurally, it seems like it makes sense to have some wood between where these two pieces come together. But that's oftentimes not the case because it facilitates the scribing process. So if you want to scribe this brace in and you don't want to have to take the frame apart, excuse me, you can do one brace at a time, and you can put it in and swing it out because there's an empty slot here beyond that. You can to swing that brace in and out of its mortise. So you do one brace at a time, and you can peg it, check it, make sure it all works, and then take that one out and then do the other brace. So that's kind of a time saver because it requires you don't have to take the frame apart one additional time. So if you notice that they shared brace and girt mortises oftentimes as well too for the same reason. And here's some of those iron pins I talked about. These are called drift pins or hook pins to hold it temporarily. And again, there's that board channel that we talked about. Here's some varieties of hook pins. This is pretty much a traditional looking one of these two here. This one I had made up from old silo hoops. And it functions just like that. You can put another pin in there and kind of unwind it to take it out of the timber so you don't have to beat on it to get it back out again. So after the longitudinal walls are done, you then do the cross frames. So here the posts were ascribed to the tie beams and all the other pieces set on here, girts and studs. And again, it's flushed up with the sills, so you don't have to re-level it or square it or anything. It's just flush, so your dimensions are all where they're supposed to be. And here's a joint that's used that double cut on it. And it's scribed to meet the wane of the piece it's going into. This is called wane here. It's the outer rounder part of the tree where it was the log was a little bit smaller, so you couldn't get a perfect square section out of the entire log. And wane is pretty typical to find on at least one end of every hewn piece, because if you want to get rid of wane, you have to do a lot of extra hewing work, and nobody wants to do any more work than they have to. So typically, the small end of the log is sized perfectly so you get a little waney corner on each of the four edges of the timber, and that tapers out as you get down the tree. Anyway, so this was cut twice. The first cut was out here at this point, and the second time it was chiseled. And here's a close-up of how that's done. So again, the first cut is back here. You can see it down here, and it's what created this shoulder here. You insert this piece into the mortise, scribe it with the compasses, take it back out, and you chop it to that line with a heavy, narrow chisel. I think it's a 1-inch chisel I'm using here. And this is a piece of yellow birch, which was extremely dense, hard wood. So this couldn't be sawed, it had to be chopped. The first time I saw this in a barn, I said, oh my gosh, they didn't saw these tenons, they chopped them all out. But if I look closely, I could see a curve on the tenon itself where they sawed it first and then chopped it to the scribe. And there's the finished piece on there. So you can see the evidence of the saw cut here. So look at that. If you take one of these buildings apart, you'll see that evidence on there. Now my barn has a common purlin roof. There's principal rafters, which are these here. And then the common purlins trench through the tops of those, and they run mostly full length. There's some that are spliced. But I've seen barns where there's 40-foot purlins set into the tops of the rafters, and I've seen them where they go for 2 bays. Depends on where you are and how long they could get the pieces. Anyway, the roof is being scribed right over the tops of the tie beams in this case. If you're doing a common rafter roof, this wouldn't be necessary unless you had a ridge beam with braces going up to the ridge. So again, it depends on your particular roof structure here. If you have purlin plates, those are extra scribing setups as well. Just like for the main frame, you'd have the longitudinal purlin plate assemblies and the cross frames. So it can be more or less work depending on what sort of roof system you have. Now they were held together with wooden pins, also called trunnels, tree nails, or pegs. Pegs is a more modern nomenclature, but it's what's used by all timber framers today, pretty much. So any one of those terms: pins, pegs, tree nails, trunnels. And they were made by riving out from round chunks of wood. Now, riving is splitting, and you do that with a froe and a wooden club, or in this case, I'm using a heavy mallet. But you're basically splitting out and getting perfectly straight grained blanks that you then are going to turn from a square into an octagon. And that was done typically on a shaving horse, which is what you're seeing me sitting on here. It's a foot-powered vise, basically, which frees up both hands to do to use a draw knife to shave the pins down with. So you start out with these square blanks here, and shave the four corners to make an octagon, and then put a point on them. And here I'm making square ones for my barn floor, and there's actually a flared head here. So they're going to stay square in this case. You can see this foot vise is clamping the head of that shaving horse is clamping the peg down with quite a bit of force. So you can use both hands to pull on that. So here's some old pins out of a building. The one at the top is from England. It's from the 14th century and 15th century, I'm sorry. And you can see the effect of the offset on it. Right here is where the tenon was in the mortise. And this part was sticking out of the joint over here. So it's a long, gentle taper with a blunt point. These come from the US, and there's varieties. You know, some are pretty nicely shaped, kind of like a rocket nose cone. Some are more pointed than others. But if you look at them closely, you'll see that every other face is a riven face. It's split. It's not, so they're only shaving the four corners, basically. You know, if you got to do all 8 sides, it's twice the work. So they had this down to a science. These are squarish pins that were used for holding flooring down. The bottom one is the only one that's octagonal. The other ones are all square with a slightly flared head. You can see it here, and a blunt point. So these are designed to hold rafters down to the plate, or to hold planking down to the floor, or hold scarf joints together. Anytime where you want to make it function like a lag screw, more so than like an offset hole in the mortise and tenon work. All right, so here's how it goes up. These frames did not go up, as far as we know, with a raising party. They certainly did that with large buildings like churches and town halls, but the evidence shows that these earlier barns went up one piece at a time, like they did in England, and you start it one way and work your way around, and using hoisting devices to set the plates on. Here's what's called a gin pole. It's a long pole that's guyed off with 3 lines, 2 in the back and 1 in the front. And you hang a block and tackle from that to haul up your timbers to put them on the building. So it takes a little bit of setup time, but it's basically like a crane for doing vertical lifts. And I've even found gin poles reused inside barns for rafters and for floor joists. They were painted, they were tapered, they were octagon. At least the ones that I'm sure are gin poles. I'm sure they had round ones as well. So we know they were using gin poles to put up these buildings. And the building crew would have been a fairly large crew, because these Scribe Rule frames required multiple people to do them. It couldn't have been a 1 or 2 or 3 man operation. It wasn't. You needed more hands on the work. That's just a close-up of my gin pole. And by the way, I put up this barn completely by myself, with absolutely no other help. And it took me 30 hours to put this up. And I'd never done that. Never put up a building that size completely by myself. So I wanted to see what was involved. And there was nothing hard or dangerous in any part of the work, or strenuous for that matter. In fact, my daughter lifted up one of the plates just to see that she could do it using this gin pole device. So it didn't take a lot of strength. It just took some coordination and knowledge. So here's the finished barn on a stone foundation, which is traditional, although sometimes it's just like pyramids of stones underneath each of the posts. Depends on how skilled the farmer was, or whether he hired a mason to come in and do that work. There's the English tying joint assembled. So in closing the barn, most English barns had vertical boarding. Some of the earliest ones might have had horizontal clapboards with a lot of vertical studs, but they figured out pretty quickly that with the wood supply here, it saved on a lot of joints if you could go with wide boards instead of you know, all these studs every 2 feet. So you typically find boards that are from 1 inch to 1.25 inches if they're just a single layer. Sometimes there's 2 layers of 3/4 boards. Sometimes there's a 1/2 inch layer with a 1 inch on the outside. You get a variety, but it's whatever was up to the particular builder. But here they're fitting into a board channel at the top. And by the way, that board channel was not to save on nails, although it did save on nails, which were not cheap. They would have been forged. It was done so you didn't have to get off the ground to put your siding on. Now, my barn, my loft is quite high in there because of me. I didn't want to bump my head on it, but typically that beam is 6 feet above the floor. And you can reach that beam, this beam, and this beam to nail. So you can put all your siding on, at least below the gable here, without getting off the ground. And that's why they did the board channel. It took about an hour to put that board channel in with a chisel and a plow plane. But I'm sure it saved much work on ladders and up and down ladders and all that sort of thing. So if you wonder why those board channels were there, that's the reason. So the square rule came in around 1800. The oldest documented one we could prove so far was 1801. That was in Hillsdale, New York. Undoubtedly, we're going to find something a little bit earlier, but I don't think it's going to be much earlier than that. Anyway, so the square rule is an American innovation, near as I can tell, where you don't have to put anything together to scribe it. You can cut each piece by itself and in any order. You don't need to number it. And then you just put everything together and it's all going to fit. So the way that works is that within every rough timber, here's a post out of a square rule building, there's a smaller perfect timber, and you cut all your joints to that smaller perfect inner timber. So let's say you have an 8x8 that you hewed out. You might frame it to a 7x7, which is within that timber. And it's almost as though you took the 8x8 and ran it through a mill to plane it down to exactly 7x7. That's the effect of the square rule. So by doing that, you can cut all your joints standard. All these housings, all these mortises, all these tenons, everything is a standard size where the pieces are going to mate. And the way they did this on a hewn piece was by snapping lines on the faces. And it's rare to find this because most chalk lines are done with white chalk and it washes away with the first rainstorm. Washes away before you even get the building together, usually. But this barn was done with red chalk, and I found this, a handful of times over the years. And one line on each face determines the edge of the joint, so that's a 2-inch line. The other line determines the inner timber, which in this case was a 12-inch timber. I think another picture of this here. Right, here we go. So there's a 2-inch joinery line. So the framing was all 2 and 2, so it'd be a 2-inch tenon and 2-inch mortise. And then this is what the timber was reduced to. So it was hewn to a 13-inch square timber, but framed down to 12. That's a big piece of wood, of course, but you're more likely to find an 8-inch timber in an English barn. That's how you would lay out a frame on a hewn piece using the square rule. And then with the braces, you would do it all using Pythagoras. It was all calculated. And you'd have a standard brace dimension here. Here's a 36-inch brace, 3 foot. And the length on that is a 50.91-inch hypotenuse. And this is just how the geometry works on that. And these numbers, this 50.91 is actually stamped on the early framing squares. The squares that were manufactured after the square rule came out would have this brace length right on the square. So you didn't even have to calculate yourself. Someone had already done it for you. You just had to follow it. You had the 24-inch brace, the 30-inch brace, 36, 48, 60, etc. So all those numbers were on the square. You didn't have to calculate. And when the square rule came in, we also see the drop tie, which is what this is. So instead of that English tying joint here, we now have a separate, we've separated the two joints basically. So the plate is not flush with the tie beam anymore or anywhere touching it. So this is more of an American derivation of the English barn frame. And of course, these are much more common now because it's after 1800 or so, you start seeing these. There's fewer of the original barn types surviving now. And this is a common rafter roof with purlin plates. So these are the purlin plates here, which are supporting the rafters at their midspan. It's a very stable roof system and became sort of the norm across the country. You find the same thing pretty much out in California, in Oregon, Washington, with some variations. It may not be an English barn frame anymore, but you'll see that same sort of drop tie, purlin plate type of structure. So I'll show you some pictures of these barns, how they look like in their natural habitat. A lot of them have been modified. Like for instance, this barn has lower doors now. It's still got an animal door here, but it's got a much lower door. It would have had a much taller door here just underneath the eaves to get into that. And of course, this is an addition onto that barn. Here's one that has the smaller door, the large doors, but no door at this end. This is not an English barn here. That's a different out barn. I think it was a horse barn. Here's one that's been raised up and doesn't have a floor in it anymore. So the door goes all the way down to the ground now. But this inside there's a 18th century English barn in all its glory. Here's one again. The doors are no longer in the side doors, no longer in this one. And it would have had hinge doors originally. The row of lights over the top of the door. Some barns had those from the get-go. Most did not. But it's a perfect place to put in lights later to get lights into the barn, because most of these early barns had no windows in them. Here's an old rundown one with the side door visible and the big doors here. There may be a door at that end, I can't tell. It's been modified. Probably got some of its original siding on it. Here's one that's been Victorianized. It's got board and batten siding on it now. Could still be the original boards, but they put battens to cover up the joints. It's got a cupola. That's not typical of these early barns. It's got sliding doors, again, not original. And it's missing the draft animal door over there. This is one of the barns that had a gin pole framed in as a rafter in the roof. And the doorway is not here anymore. It's on the other side of the barn. There's a door, but this side, it's not there. It's also been turned from its original configuration. Here's one that has the original cow door here. The threshing bay doors, which have been shortened up, they originally went up to here. And this has all been added later. The shape is there. You can see that these are all the same shape because of the equilateral triangle. They all end up being the same exact proportion. So it's really hard to tell when you find a big one. There might be one that's 34 by 44 or something, but it looks just like the other ones that are smaller than 30 by 40. It's identical proportion. So there's until you get it up there and measure them, it's hard to tell whether you're dealing with a larger one or a smaller one because of that. Here's a particularly nice one, which is gone now, but the doors have been taken out. It was raised up to put a basement underneath it. And of course, then you don't need a big door up here anymore. If there's a walkout basement, the door would go to nowhere. It was common to move barns around, to roll them, drag them, or dismantle them. move them closer to the house, connect them to the house, etc. There's all kinds of stories about people moving barns. There's one in a town near me where they were bringing the barn down from up behind the house. It was on a hill up above the house. I don't know, maybe 100, 150 feet away. And they were rolling it down, and it got away from them and rolled past the house across the street. And they said, by golly, if that's where she wants to be, that's where she's going to stay. So it was a funny story about that particular one. So in the 1850s, when farming was changing, there's a great book out called Big House, Little House, Back House Barn by Thomas Hupka, if you're interested in this sort of thing, where they talk about the repositioning of buildings throughout New England, and probably the Northeast in general, to accommodate changes in farming and lifestyles and things. So these buildings that were standalone basically on a single level barn, they moved them and made them into bank barns and attached them to L's off the houses, etc. So here's another one that's been raised up with a basement underneath, and it doesn't have the original doorways here anymore, and it's been shingled. But inside, I think it has the original boarding in there. And here's one that I was involved with as an architect. There were 2 English barns put end to end. And by the way, if you wanted a bigger barn in early times, you would just basically lay out 2 barns end to end or 3 barns end to end, and have separate threshing bay doors for each one of those barns. Even though they were built as one unit, they would have separate doorways. So that's how you made a bigger English barn, typically, or for a larger farm. But this particular one was 2 barns put together, and because they were so standard, you could take a barn from another farm and it would almost always fit your barn. You could plug it right up against the gable and they would line up. Sometimes the roof pitches are a little off, but it's amazing how many barns I've seen put together that were different periods and from different locales, done by different builders, and they still would mate to each other when they put the 2 barns together. And this has its original layout for this barn. It's got a door here and a door here. This is the cow bay. Here's the wider bay for the draft animals. And originally they would have been hinged doors like we see here to get into the barn. Cupola, again, is a later thing. Here's a nice little one in my town. It doesn't have the side doors. It has sliding doors, but you can see the English barn shape in there. And we're losing a lot of these barns. My town has no more barns from the Scribe Rule period. And some of the surrounding towns will still have a few left. There'll be 2 or 3 or 4, but the majority are the drop tie later, after 1800 sort of period barns. And this one has since collapsed. And it was a gem. It even had an addition with the gunstock posts on it, a lean-to addition, which is pretty rare. So I've recorded a lot of these buildings. I've taken photographs and measurements, but I haven't been able to keep up with it. So it's really sad. Here's one I was involved with on restoration. There were 2 English barns, and this is a smaller version here. I think it was 26 feet wide, and this was like 34. And they were moved and raised up and provided with a walkout basement. And at that time, the floor was repaired in them, and it's a square rule floor framing, but it's a Scribe Rule building up above. So they either put the floor in the building before they moved it, before they rolled it or dragged it, or they dragged it and brought it to the new site and just put it onto the new floor framing. So thank you for your patience. I'm sorry I might have run over a little bit on here, but I'm ready for questions. So if you'll mute yourself, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Jack, I wanted to ask